Hello everybody, and welcome to this second day of Tech Days, probably the second session for most of you already. This session on the Windows Phone track is about advanced data access strategies. It's a level 400 session, so I just want to state in advance, just to make sure no one's here who doesn't want to be here, that this is a session that will not really focus on simple, quick and dirty data access, but it will more focus on once you've got a service, how can you secure it, how can you ensure your data is encrypted, how can you ensure only a certain person can access your data. And it does require a bit of advanced knowledge. So I will be talking about SOAP service, REST service. We'll be talking about leveraging WCF RIA services, domain service. There's 1 hour of time. I've got about 6 or 7 demos, so I will have to go quite fast. But I hope it will remain understandable. If not, just ask me questions after the session or afterwards on Twitter or anything. Just let me know. Also, code will be made available afterwards. Let's start by introducing myself. My name is Kevin. I'm a technical consultant and solution manager for the chaps at Real Dolmen, which is a Belgian ICT company. It's one of the bigger ones in Belgium. I come from a web background, actually. I started creating ASP.NET web apps, C#, of course. And then I gradually moved to Silverlight, so doing all the XAML stuff, let's say. So the switch to, well, not really a switch, but taking Windows Phone on in my daily work was quite a logical next step. Next part will probably be Windows 8, as long as it has to do with XAML. My coordinates are on screen, so you can contact me through mail, Twitter, or have a look at my blog if you wish. I'm also the author of Silverlight 5 Data and Services Cookbook, which is the follow-up to the Silverlight 4 Data and Services Cookbook. It should be out around the end of the month, I think. And it's a book focused on building line-of-business applications with Silverlight. So it's not really a book that will tell you where you should put your control and how all that XAML stuff, styling works. It's a book about accessing data and using certain design patterns throughout your application. And it also includes a part on Windows Phone. And that's all I'm going to say about that. What are we going to talk about today? Well, I've built a small application, actually a really small one. The Windows Phone application part consists of a few views with a few buttons on them to fetch data and submit data. That's really it. And that's actually all I need to explain the different ways of accessing your data here. I'm quickly going to show the application, but most of this session will have to do not as much with coding as with configuring. As when you've got your services up and running, making them secure, making them handle identity well, has got more to do with writing the correct configuration code, client and server side, than with actually coding more stuff in C# code. We're going to start by creating a simple WCF service with 2 simple methods, one to get a bunch of customers from a database, one to save one. And we're going to consume it from the Windows Phone application. That's the simplest part. I'm sure most of you will already have done something like this. Now we're going to see how we can secure access to this application. That's talking about 2 things: transport security, so encrypting the data that's being sent over the wire, and ensuring only certain persons can access your data. So security here is actually 2 parts. Next we're going to go to a REST service. There's a lot of services on the internet these days are REST based. Can we access that through Windows Phone, and how can we access that through Windows Phone? That's what we're going to do here. Of course I need to create one first. So I'll use WCF service with webget attributes for this one. Then consuming this, a bit harder than a regular SOAP service. You can't just add a reference to a REST service anymore. And we'll see what we can do about securing access. What does Windows Phone support in this case, because not everything we're used to is supported. Then a little sidestep. Where's my domain? You will see that when we create a REST service, it does not generate proxy classes on the client side. So you'll typically have to, in a lot of cases I see code just being copied from server side, the DTO that's being sent over to wire, that class. In a lot of cases I see that just being copied to the client. There's probably a better way of solving this, and we'll look into one of the options. Then WCF RIA services. I'm putting this in because a lot of people, at least a lot of the projects I work on are people who have already a Silverlight application running. And for Silverlight applications, WCF RIA services is often a logical choice. But those clients now and in the future hopefully also want mobile clients, or a mobile client to access that same data that's accessible on the Silverlight client they have. If they've built that with WCF RIA services, can they just reuse those domain services? We'll see whether or not we can. Well, we can actually, else I wouldn't be talking about it. And how we can do that. Then I'm going to host that stuff in the cloud. This is not a cloud session. There's a really great cloud session this afternoon. So why do I want to put this in this session? Because what I want to show here is how simple and how easy it is. If you have an application up and running, and all of a sudden your application becomes popular, and it's using services, or it's using database somewhere, which it typically does, you do want your application to keep up and running. You do not want a server overload, because all of a sudden 10,000 people are doing the same thing at the same time. Let's hope they are, because that means your application is becoming very popular. So how can you solve that? And how easy is it to start hosting your services and your data in the cloud? That's what I'm going to talk about here. And I'm going to try and leave some time for conclusion and Q&A. Okay, the application. I'm quickly going to show it, just to show you how it's structured. That's this side. That's important at the moment. So let's have a look at that. 4 projects. Client application. This is a Windows Phone application. And server side, I've made 3 different service hosts. One to host my REST service, one to host RIA service, domain service, and one to host my regular WCF service, which I'll add a reference to, also based. The cloud stuff, that comes after this. On the client side, let's start like this. I'm using the model view model design pattern. I think most of you will probably know about that. That's more or less the de facto standard if you're building XAML applications. So not only Windows Phone applications, but WPF, Silverlight, Surface actually. Should probably use MVVM. And in Windows 8, Metro, XAML, C# mix, it's probably a good idea to do that as well. I prefer to use MVVM Lite. There are lots of libraries out there. A good tip is if you're starting to use MVVM, and that's actually a general tip, don't just start writing all of it yourself. It's pretty easy to write your own simple MVVM enabling framework. But there really are a few good lightweight frameworks out there that are easy to use, that are free, that are open source, and that can easily be added to your project. It's a bit like reinventing the hot water every time and time again. If we want to keep costs a bit down, we should try not to do that. Another small tip I want to add here is managing external dependencies. It's not really Windows Phone related, not only Windows Phone related, but in a lot of projects you are using external libraries, like for example model view model Lite in my example, in my application. But there's other ones as well. There are RIA services libraries that you might want to use. There are there's a library for parallel processing available you might want to use. There's lots of stuff, component vendors, user controls, lots of stuff you might want to use in your application. And after a while, it can become quite a hassle to manage all those external dependencies, because one library might depend on other libraries, and you need to make sure all those references are in place, and that if you check it in your source control system, that once someone checks it out, he also has those necessary assemblies. Well, there's a really nice tool to manage all this stuff, and that's called NuGet. I don't know if you heard about it. It's actually you can look at it as a packet manager, a dependency manager. It's by far the easiest way I found up until now to manage external references in your application. Install the plugin. You can find it at nuget.org. Install the plugin in your Visual Studio. Open it. Select which package you want to use in your application. In my example, I've looked for MVVM Lite. Press the install button, and that's about it. It will add the necessary references to your application. It will copy the necessary and correctly versioned assemblies to a local file, a local folder, packages. It will reference them from there. So if you check that into your source control, including the package directory, you ensure that everyone will always be able to run your application without having to install all kinds of stuff on his computer. The nice thing is this also manages dependencies that your dependencies depend on. It's a bit, lots of dependencies in one sentence. But if there's a library that depends on other libraries and you install it using NuGet, it will automatically install the other dependencies as well. Just a quick tip, it's one of my favorite additions from last year to Visual Studio, let's say. Oh, and there's actually, once you get used to NuGet, there's actually a way to manage your own packages. You often have your own framework, built in 1, 2, 3, 4 assemblies, I don't know. There's a tool called myget that actually enables you to create your own NuGet-like packages. So if you have a framework in your company and you use it on a lot of projects, and you want to ensure every project always has the correct latest version and the external dependencies are managed correctly, you could check out myget. I think you can find it at myget.org, or if you type it in Google or Bing, you will definitely find it. That's NuGet, but for managing your own packages. Okay, so far for that tip. I don't have any affiliation with NuGet, by the way. So it's just something I like to use. Let's see. That's for application. If we run it, never mind that. That's just a non-accessible directory browsing. So it's good that this is actually there. Got a few views. Fetch and submit. So fetch and submit REST. Fetch and submit data with RIA services. So that's the app. Now, let's start with SUP. First, we're going to create a service. I'm first going to say what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to actually do it in code. Create a WCF service. I add 2 methods, and I use an entity framework data store for my backend, so an ORM. Of course, if you use an ORM like the entity framework, you know it generates entity classes. You can't just send those entity classes over the wire. You can't just send those to the client. And you probably don't want to send them to the client. You can't send them because they're not just serializable. You don't want to send them because, in this case, you're working on creating a phone application. So that's the first tip. You're creating a phone application, so keep the stuff you're sending over the wire as small as possible. Don't send over properties you're not going to use. Don't send over state, for example. Is it changed? Is it updated? You don't need that. If you don't need it in your client application, don't send it over, because your phone user might be on a Wi-Fi connection, which will probably, well, in which case it probably won't matter if you send over a few properties too many. But he might as well be on a 3G or even a GPRS edge connection, in which case he will suffer if your data you want to send over the wire is too much. So try to keep that to a minimum. So I create the method, the service methods. I'm going to create a DTO, the class I'm going to send over the wire. Must be serializable. For this I use a data contract and data member. And of course I need a mapper. So I'm going to send over DTOs to my client, and I'm going to get them back from the client. I need to have a mapper to map those to the entities I'm using in my entity framework model. And then there's two ways, in essence, two ways to expose that service. You can expose it using basic HTTP binding that's supported by Windows Phone. And you can expose it using a custom binding with binary message encoding. The second, I'm going to show both, but the second one is actually better because it already compresses your data. Due to the binary message encoding, the data that's being sent over the wire will be smaller by default. Of course, it's proprietary, so you can't just read it in clear text from another technology anymore. But if you're using simple only one Windows Phone client, that might be a good option. And then we will consume that service after we've created it. And that's actually not too special for most of you, I think. We're going to create some proxy classes. Well, let's say Visual Studio is going to do that for us. Simply adding a service reference to my SVC file. It will generate the necessary reference, the necessary proxy classes client side. So you get a proxy client to call your service, and you get a client side representation of the DTO you're sending over the wire. And it will also create a service references.client config file, and that's where we will spend most of our time in the web config on the server and the client config on the client, because this is where our bindings will be put. Consuming the service itself, simply initializing the proxy client, call the get method to get your data, or call the save method to submit your data. It's actually very much as what we're used to as .NET developers, I think. So let's do that. I'm going to show you what I made here. This is my service host for my SOAP service. And first of all, I've created a DTO. That's what I'm going to send over the wire. Customer DTO with an ID, a name, a description, and an address. If you look at my model, you will notice that it's very simple, but it does have more properties. I know that in my application, I have no need for the latitude and longitude property, so I simply do not send them over. They're not part of my DTO. Then of course I need a mapper. This will map a customer entity to a customer DTO entity, and a customer DTO entity to a customer entity. Also the other way around. That's actually just copy-paste the necessary properties, of course. It's a very simple mapper. And then my service itself. I've got a get customers method returning a simple list of customer DTO. And I fetch all the items, customers from my context. I map them, add them to the return list, and return that list. Very simple and not that special actually. To save the customer, simply the other way around. I get the corresponding customer, and I either change some values and submit them, or I create a new customer. So the save method is for inserting and adding customers, and save the changes. This is just a quick and dirty entity framework code actually. With that in place, I've actually already got my service. So what's next? You add a service reference. SOAP, customer service reference, I've named it. And you add that service reference to the customer service.svc file. Just simply right-clicking, add service reference. Once that's done, a lot of code will be created. Proxies, actually. And the first thing you'll see that what is created is a client-side version of your customer DTO, client-side version of what's being sent over the wire. containing my 4 fields. What's also important to notice here is that it automatically generates the necessary property changed raising events. That means that I can easily bind this customer DTO to my UI, because thanks to the raise property changed, if I change something in my code, my UI will automatically be notified, as is the case with XAML applications actually. Next to that, it also creates, let's see, where is it? Our customer service client, of which I will use an instance to access my data. So, up until now, I think that's what most of you already know from regular .NET. Now let's go and look at the bindings, because this is where it becomes interesting actually. Let's see. I'm going to start with the custom binding using binary message encoding. So, what do I need to do? I'm using WCF here. I create a custom binding and I state, well, this binding will use binary message encoding over HTTP. Then I create an endpoint. The endpoint is the way through which my service is accessible. I don't specify an address, so that means it's just accessible through customer service.svc. Say, well, this endpoint will use binding custom binding. That's actually this one. No, sorry. It will use a custom binding with this binding configuration, and that's actually this one. So I'm stating here I've got an endpoint at address that'll be localhost / dashboard.servicehost.soap / customerservice.svc. It will be a custom binding using binary message encoding and HTTP transport. And the contract is, of course, my SVC service itself. That's a pretty simple way of using binary message encoding. Now, to access this from the client, I need to have a matching binding on the client. And that's the important part. So, on the client, on the server, I've got web.config. On the client, I've got service references.client.config. And what I see here is I do exactly the same. This, by the way, is generated, but I like to, well, actually, once you've written it on your own a few times, it gets very easy to understand and very easy to do. It's a lot more interesting to do it like that than to just have it generate some code that does some things behind the screen. It's pretty important to know what's actually going on here. And what is going on is that we need a match from client to server. So on the server I defined binary encoding HTTP. What do I do on the client? Say, well, a custom binding using binary message encoding over HTTP. And through which endpoint am I going to access this? I put in the address, which is where my service resides. I say, well, it's a custom binding using the configuration I've just created above. And that's about it. Now I've got a matching binding on the service, on the server side and on the client side. Okay. So, onto the code. Fetching this, I instantiate a new client proxy. Don't have to pass in anything. It gets all its configuration from the service references.client.config file. I simply call the getCustomers method, and once it's completed, I add it as a result. Submitting, for each type of service access, I added necessary methods to insert, update, etc. So you can look at that afterwards if you're wondering how that goes. But I'm going to focus more on the bindings and the configuration here. So you get the customers and set it as a result. Let's see if that actually works. Press the fetch button. Now I get into my breakpoint. And I've got my list of customers from my database. Okay, so far so good. Now, one step beyond. That's simple access of your data. How can you go about securing this? We're talking about two things when we're talking about securing our calls. We're talking about securing the transport data, the transport. So that's what you will typically use SSL for, HTTPS. And the second part we're talking about is ensuring only a certain user can access the service. So that's identity we're talking about. If we really want to secure our calls, we'll need both. That's the logical next thing. Now, there's a few limitations on this. One of the limitations, and that's actually a very good limitation by design, is that you cannot transport username without using SSL. Username actually stands for username password. That's a binding configuration you can use, and it's impossible to do that without doing it over a secured connection. If you think about it, that's actually very good, because what would happen if it were possible to do this? Transporting using username for credential checking means the username and password get sent over the wire with each request. So you request to get customers method. The username passwords get sent over the wire. Server side, these are checked against some kind of validator or data store or Active Directory, whatever actually. And then you either have access or you don't. Now, if it were possible to do that without SSL, that would mean it would be possible to send over your username and password in clear text over the internet, probably. Very, very, very bad idea. So that's why there's a limitation. This is only possible using SSL. So that means your data is encrypted. Using SSL, HTTPS means the data that's sent over the wire is encrypted. So in this case, we're going to need both. So we'll start with setting up SSL, transport security, and then we're going to continue with passing in the credentials and checking them. Now, let's have a look at how that works. And from now on, it's a lot of changing configuration actually. So I go to the web config at my server side again. Up until now I've used this binary message encoding. I told you I was going to use both. So now I'm going to use the basic HTTP binding. By the way, all I'm going to do here, so transport security, username, credentials, that's also possible with the custom binding. Just going to show it here so you can see both. First, I'm going to start by securing our transport. So I say, well, I'm going to use a basic HTTP binding, and I'm going to set the security mode to transport. Transport, that's the SSL I'm going to need here. Then, of course, I need an endpoint that uses this binding. So let's see. That should be this one. Basic HTTP binding using the secured binding configuration. I've just created a few paragraphs above here. Then onto the client, I need the same bindings on the client. So let's put this in comments again. Well, I'm going to use basic HTTP binding using transport security. So that's on the client. And then I need an endpoint here. Well, an endpoint config. That's this one. And there we go. And of course, I'm using HTTPS here, so no longer just regular HTTP. Now, to enable this, you of course need to make sure your local host has some kind of certificate so it can serve HTTPS pages. So let's have a look at that. I host everything on my default website in this case. Let's have a look at the bindings. As you can see, I've already enabled HTTPS binding here using the local host certificate. That's actually self-signed certificate. So that means My service host is HTTPS enabled. I've got my endpoints up and running. I don't need to change anything in code because instantiating the client proxy will use the configuration here. So let's see what happens. And this actually shouldn't work. We'll see. And indeed, what do I get? There was no endpoint listening at HTTPS, etc., etc., etc. That's weird because there actually is an endpoint listening. We know that for sure. I'm going to prove that. Just copy the address here. As we can see, there's actually an endpoint listening here. Configuration is right, it's HTTPS. My certificate is trusted. This should be okay. So what's the problem? Well, I'm using a self-signed certificate here, which is very typical during development. You would use self-signed certificates. Once you roll it out, you would, of course, buy a certificate with a trusted authority like VeriSign or one of the other ones. Maybe one that hasn't been breached in the last months. And Windows Phone trusts these root certification authorities. So all the big vendors are automatically trusted by Windows Phone. So you can access HTTPS sites using one of their certificates from your Windows Phone. Problem, of course, Windows Phone does not trust my own root certificate authority, which is actually my local host that signed my self-signed certificate. So that's a bit of a problem. I need to somehow install that self-signed certificate root authority on my Windows Phone emulator. Can we do that? Well, actually we can. How do you do that? What I've done is I've created a certificate. I've exported the certificate I'm using, and I've exported that to a file. And that file, that's actually the certificate. To ensure my Windows Phone trusts that one, I need to install that certificate on my phone. How do you do that? Well, you simply surf to it. What I've done is, let me show you. Here, content view. I exported my root certificate authority actually as rootcert.p7b. It's actually just p7b format. And I've hosted it on my local host. So what do I do now? I surf to that location. Console. rootcert.p7b. Oh, oops. And my emulator starts asking me, do you want to install this certificate? Local host certificate. So that's the correct one. Of course I want to install it. And there we go. Now, let's run my application again. Close. And there we go. Now I do get my data back because certificate authority is trusted on my phone emulator. Okay, so far for securing transport. Now getting identity, well, ensuring only certain persons can access my service. Again, we start with the bindings. So what do I do here? I no longer only define transport security, but I state I want to use transport with message credential security. There's no simple message credential security, it's always transport with. So it's actually limited to over SSL. And I say, well, use username as client credential type, that stands for username password combination. That's the binding. And as far as the endpoint is concerned, that's this one. Okay. Now, Am I missing something? I now stated that I should receive credentials from the client, but I still need to provide a way to check these credentials somehow. So I'm going to get in a username and a password. Now I need some way to check if these are valid, of course. And we can do that as well. There are various ways of doing this. Some people like to get their service context in each service method and check username and password from there. One of the things I like to do, because it ensures I only have to write code once on one place, is using a custom validator to check this for me. So I'm first going to state that I want to use a custom validator, changing my default behavior. And I state, well, for service credentials, the ones that get passed in, I'm going to use username authentication using a custom username password validation. And what is that custom username password validation? Well, that's actually defined here. It's dashboard.servicehost.soap.customer custom username password validator. That class is going to check if the credentials that I pass in are correct. Of course, I need to write that class. That's probably the simplest username password check you've ever seen. If username is WP7 and password is WP7, I can continue, otherwise I can't. Do not use this in the production environment. Typically this is where you could go to a data store or whatever you use to change your to check your credential or to keep your credentials. So far for configuration on the server. Configuration on the client. Let's have a look. There we go. I just need to change the binding a bit. Instead of using transport security, I use transport with message credential security. I do not need to change the endpoint because I actually kept the name the same. So the endpoint I defined is still the same. So far for configuration. Now there's one thing left. I of course need to pass in my credentials when I call my service. I actually passed it into the proxy client instance. So let's have a look at that. That's the SOAP view model still. On your client proxy instance you will have a client credentials property which you can use to pass in username and password. Okay, now let's run this. SOAP, fetch data, and all of a sudden I'm in my username password validator. So the credentials have been passed in, my service call has been executed. Now I validate it. Normally that should be okay. And again I get my results. So what we have now is a SOAP service secured not only on a transport level but also on an identity level. Okay, that was a long demo. The other ones are shorter. Next up, REST. A lot of services on the web use REST. Can we do that with WP7? Well, of course we can. It's again on the server a matter of bindings. There's actually a web HTTP binding provided through WCF, which you can use to expose a WCF service as a REST service in combination with the web get attribute. I will immediately show you this. And on the client we can no longer use the proxy generation, but we can use a web client. Web client is provided in Windows Phone 7 and it provides common methods for sending and receiving data coming from a certain URI. So you can use the web client to, for example, access a static XML file somewhere. But as you know, if you're using a REST service, the REST service is actually also accessible through a URI which defines what the data will be returned. So in fact, from that point of view, for the web client, it's actually just a resource identified by a URI. So the web client is used for that. Let's see how we can do that. Let's see. That's of course the second client. Again, that same customer service. And here I use the webGet attribute. This will make sure my regular WCF operation method is exposed through REST. And what do I state here? I state, well, this method should be accessible by URI template get all customers. So if you take the service location / get all customers, this is what will be returned, and return it in JSON format. There are other formats, but typically JSON is used. It's a bit smaller than just using XML, for example. And there are nice data contract serializers available on the client to work with JSON. Again, I included a save method for your reference, but it's actually more of the same. And I need to expose that. And how do you do that? First of all, I define my endpoint behavior should use the web HTTP behavior. And I define an endpoint. In this case, I don't need any other binding configuration because I'm okay with the defaults in this case. So what do I say? An endpoint at default address using a web HTTP binding, using the web behavior configuration I've just shown you, and of course using the customer service contract, which is just my service. That's it. On to the client. And you'll see that I don't have to change anything here as far as configuration is concerned. Contrary to the previous thing we did, the SOAP service, the service is accessible through the web client. So all we need to know is a URI. We do no longer need to define bindings on the client, no longer need to define anything that has to do with security behaviors on the client. As far as the client is concerned, we're accessing something that's at a certain URI. We're not even accessing a service per se. But of course, there's a few more things I need to do. As in the previous example, I could use that SOAP service that created the proxy, customer DTO proxy on the client when I added the reference. I don't have that in this case. So what did I do? I created manually a customer DTO on the client. This customer DTO, pretty simple. I've got an ID, name, description, address. It actually matches what's on the server. And by defining the data member names, I actually state, well, once I cast one to the other one, ID should be matched to ID, name to name, description to description, address to address. It's actually pretty easy, pretty simple class as well. For even a better experience, you might want to have this class implement iNotify property changed, if you wish. So the UI gets automatically updated when you update this class. For this demo, that wasn't necessary, but you can do that. How do we access this then? Of course, I define a base URL. It's actually where I can find my service. That's the default location, by the way. And then it's on to the load customers command. So I state find the data at my base URI plus get all customers, instantiate the web client, download string async from that URI, and once that's been completed, go to the completed event handler. And in the completed event handler, I will somehow need to parse my result. That's a JSON string. I parse that result using the data contract JSON serializer. Built-in stuff. Pretty easy to use.
Sorry, I have to ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
That's not very clean way of doing this.
Mm-hmm.
I've used the
Mm-hmm.
that and inherit from megabytes and also
Yeah.
implement the interface.
You've used web client to.
Yeah, and then it does all this for you. You don't need to do any settings.
Yeah, you can. What you did was create a custom version of web client with some extra. Yeah, indeed, that's another option. So you just create your own, and that can take care of this for you.
You define your URIs in the web
Mhm.
file, then you don't need to do anything.
Yeah, indeed, you can indeed do that as well. But this for demo purposes to show you what. Yeah, there's lots of, you can inherit from it and put some more code in there. Get your data from config file for the. Indeed, absolutely. Okay, that's one way of doing this. So your own class. In this case, I'm showing the more basic way. Let's say use the data contract JSON serializer to serialize what you get back from the server on your client into the type of ETO you need here. Okay, and that's about it.
Sorry, the class's name is client base.
Hmm?
Client base.
Client base, that's what you inherit from.
Yeah, and you also implement the data contract.
Yeah, so that's actually a good tip. Yeah. From inherit from client base, implement data contract interface, and you can write your own client in which you can add code like I did here in my view model. Okay. I fetch my data. And there we go. I'm on my server in get customers. I'm back on my client. I use dispatcher begin invoke to ensure it's synced to my UI thread. And there we go, I've got my data. Now how do I secure this? Server side, these services are hosted through IIS. So in IIS I can state I want basic authentication, I want Windows authentication. It's actually the stuff we're used to from, if you ever worked with ASP.NET before, that's probably come up. Windows Phone supports basic authentication at the moment. So that's something you configure on IIS, basic authentication. And what you need to do then, let's have a look here. Again, I'm going to do this over SSL. Security mode transport, client credential type basic. You can put other values in here as well. Digest Windows authentication certificate. But at the moment, stuff that's supported by Windows Phone is basic. Let's see. And that's actually the same as before, but now I'm using my secured binding configuration. Okay. So far for the server side. Now for the client side. A lot of this is actually the same. I'm just gonna change this to call my secured, call my customer secured. Let's go there. And now I need to pass in network credentials. Now the question is, where does it get these credentials from? It's IIS that provides these credentials. So it's no longer, as I did before, writing a custom username validator or anything. I'm using basic authentication here, so IIS provides these credentials for me. So where are these coming from? In my case, that's my company's Active Directory. By the way, that password will not work after lunch anymore. So in this case, I'm using basic authentication, and the credentials that are being checked are provided through IIS. Depending on your machine configuration, on your server configuration, that can be an Active Directory, that can be a custom store. It really depends on how your IIS is set up and how your security mode is set up. But that's a bit more, well, actually it's less work as a programmer. Let's put it like that. Now to add these, you can just add the credentials to the client.credentials property. Those will be passed in. Now I will get my data. Okay, there we go. Complete it again. And normally I have my data now using transport security and identity. Okay. So that was securing our calls. I immediately did that demo as well. Now, just one slide in between, and that's also a tip. As you might have noticed, I have a customer DTO on the server now, on my REST side, and I have a customer DTO on the client side. A lot of people just copy-paste that stuff. There's actually a way of sharing this domain throughout different CLR versions. So that means an assembly that can be referenced by the server side, full.NET, and the client side, which is Windows Phone CLR. That's called the Portable Class Library. It's actually pretty nice stuff. I'm not going to demo this because I'm going to run out of time otherwise, but it will be in my completed solution, which I will put on my blog and will be available through the TechDays site. What this actually does is it enables you to create an assembly which contains your DTOs in this case, and I can simply reference that on my service host on the server side, so my REST service host, and on the client side. And I no longer need to keep two different customer DTOs in two different places. Just put them in one place and you can reference them on both sides. That kind of saves you some work, and it keeps all your logic in one place, all your objects in one place. That can also be used with regular Silverlight and full.NET, by the way. Okay, what about RIA services then? Can you leverage that for Windows Phone 7? Who's been working with WCF RIA services here? A few people. Okay, for those this will be quite obvious. I hope the other people will have something about this as well. Regular WCF RIA services not available in Windows Phone 7. So what do you do if you've created a bunch of domain services and you want to reuse that? Do you need to write stuff on top of that? Well, luckily, WCF RIA services, domain services, can be exposed, SOAP, REST, and even OData endpoints. So you can use your WCF RIA services, expose them with SOAP, REST, or OData endpoints, and consume them like that. So the techniques I've shown you, using SOAP, using REST, you can use those with your domain services as well, as long as you expose your domain services with the SOAP and REST endpoints. OData is read-only, by the way, so that's typically not used that much. Where can you find this? These endpoints are in assemblies that are available through the WCF RIA Services Toolkit. You can download that toolkit, add the necessary references, or do it through NuGet, as I've done. So, let's see how that's done. I've already created a simple domain service. My query method returns a bunch of customers. I've created an authentication service, which again checks for username and password WP7. The special part is actually in my web config file. This is all regular WCF RIA services code. There's nothing specific I did about this. But I did install the, where do I find them? Where are my endpoints? Microsoft.servicemodel.domainservices.hosting. This assembly contains new endpoint configurations. Once you install this, all you need to do is add, well, we're going to use SOAP, so I actually needed to add one line of code, this one, to my web config file, and by adding that line of code, all of a sudden my domain services are accessible through regular SOAP, or in JSON that's the REST part actually. So that's it as far as configuration on the server is concerned. Now onto the client. I've chosen to use the SOAP version. What do you do? Well, again, I just added two references, one to my customer domain service to get and save my data, one to my authentication domain service to authenticate. So it's a lot of reuse of existing code. And I'm first going to go to the configuration, of course. What have we got here? There we go. I'm immediately going to skip to the secured mode. Oh. So what do I do here? I create a binding. Simple basic HTTP binding using transport security. So again, data is encrypted. And I do the same for the second service. So I've got a domain service I expose and an authentication domain service I expose. Again, using transport security. And of course I need to expose these as endpoints. And there we go. I need to configure where you can find them. And there we go. So that's same as before. I'm using the configurations I've just created above. Now, where are these services to be found? Well, actually by default there's an implicit SVC file for each domain service. And each domain service, that SVC file can be accessed through, that's actually namespace dash instead of dot, subnamespace domain service name. So that's actually where you can find your domain services as SVC or WCF services, let's say. How do I go about accessing this? I'm going to go for the secure immediately. And actually, that again is a lot of what we're used to. The only thing that's a bit different here is the security. With WCF RIA services, you actually use an authentication service to check whether or not I have access to that service. So that's actually an authentication service on which you call the login method. And once that login method returns, you can use the cookie container that's returned from that service and that contains your credentials to call all the other domain services. That's what's actually happening here. So I create a client proxy, regular SOAP. I call login, passing in my credentials. I return. I check whether or not I have results. And from then on, I use these results, which are actually my user credentials, as a cookie container for my other calls. So I log in, I return, and then I pass in what I get back from my authentication service to each subsequent call to the cookie container. And then I call my getCustomers method. For each service method you have, for each query method in your domain service, you will get an operation client side. Again, I have written quite a bit of code. You can check on how to submit data to those domain services. You can even create client-side change sets with related data. So it actually works quite well. We did a few applications like that because we had some up and running Silverlight applications already. Let's see. Load. This is my authentication domain service I'm in. Shouldn't have an error. I load my customers now. This is my domain service. You can actually state that it should require authentication and that it should require the secure endpoint, which limits regular HTTP access or unauthenticated access. And there we go, reuse of our RIA domain services and authentication service. Now there's one thing left, hosting this stuff in the cloud, and the good thing is that it only takes 2 minutes. So there's a cloud session in the afternoon. Really check that one out. because he will talk about a lot more than a few things I'm going to state here. But one tip, there's actually a cloud-enabled, to build a cloud-enabled WP7 app, there's actually a Windows Azure toolkit for Windows Phone available. I am sure Ali will talk about this in this session later on as well. There's two things you can host in the cloud. First of all, you can host your data in the cloud. Instead of using my local database with the customers, I can use a SQL Azure database. Now, stupid as it may sound, how do you migrate your local database to an Azure database? First of all, you need an account for that. I don't have that at the moment. So you need a SQL Azure account. It's actually just a matter of changing the connection string in your application. That's how easy it is. For now, my application has a connection string defined in its web.config file going to my local database. It could go on the server to a database. Once your data is in the SQL Azure database, just change the connection string to the location of your SQL Azure database. That's actually how it's done. The thing is, it's a little problem in my state of mind, let's say. There is no local SQL Azure database available. So how do you test this locally? Well, what's typically advised through MSDN and by Microsoft, SQL Azure database, even though it's less featured, most of the basic features are more or less the same as what you get with SQL 2008 release 2. So that's how we actually work at the moment. If we develop locally, we develop on SQL 2008 release 2. And once we roll out, or for testing, or for development environment online, we copy that data to our SQL Azure database in the cloud. As far as coding is concerned, it's really just a matter of changing your connection string. It works with Entity Framework on top of it. It just simply works. That's actually very nice, I think. But typically, just the data isn't enough. You also want to host your services in the cloud. Now, how do you do that? Well, also for this, there's a pre-existing template available. Once you install the Windows Azure SDK, you get a bunch of templates. There's actually something called the WCF service role. You can use this WCF service role to add a new project to your application which is specifically aimed at hosting WCF services. Our SOAP service was a WCF service. So how do you do that? Let's open that, show you the code. Remap some stuff. Meanwhile, I will close this. I can close that down already. Okay, so what I've done here is, and I'm not saying this is best practice, I'm saying this is how easy it is. I've added a new Azure cloud project. I've actually added a new WCF service role to that. It's actually just add new project. Where is it? Cloud, Windows Azure project. Once you do that, you will get a screen where you can choose what role you want to add. And in my case, I added a WCF service rep role. So that's all I did, and all that stuff gets created. I'm going to cancel out of this now. What I did then was I simply took what was in here, customer DTO, my service, my validator, my mapper, and my entity framework model, and copied it over to my service web role. I didn't even have to change my service references here, because, well, the proxies are still the same. All that's changed is the address of the service, actually. And in my cloud view model, I am just calling actually the same as we did in the beginning. Now if I start this one up, one weird thing is how come this works. Why is it the copying and pasting, okay, that should work, but why is it that this works with my local database? I've copied over the entity framework model, and the connection string does not refer to a connection string in the cloud. It actually refers to my local SQL Server database on my computer. How come this Azure Storage Emulator, let's say, can access that local database? But the nice thing is it actually runs in the same local context. So as long as you're on your development machine, you can not only have a local Azure emulator, you don't need a SQL Azure database to check, to test. You can actually use your own local database. I was actually amazed that was possible. Okay, so my customer service is running up in the cloud. It created one at my localhost port 81. And if I start this one up, I load my customers, tries to get them. I'm at my server side in my cloud hosted service. I'm back on the client, and there's my data. So this isn't the complete cloud story by far, but it does show you how easy it can be if you quickly need more capacity because your app has suddenly become hugely popular. It's actually very, very easy to do. Okay, so with Windows Phone 7 you can consume and reuse most existing services quite easily. So I've specifically tried to show you the 3 different types of services to show you that Windows Phone actually supports the reuse of those. You'll probably already have applications up and running. And you can actually secure your services both on a transport level and an identity level. That's very important. Unless you want everyone to be able to access your data, you really should use HTTPS, use some kind of security. And if you're inspecting usage, heavy usage, it's almost trivial to quickly migrate those services to the cloud, to SQL Azure database when it's needed. Okay, so if anyone has got any questions, I would love to try and answer. Yes?
What about the SOAP service? If I develop it in Java, is there any problem making the service references to that kind?
So you want to develop a SOAP service in Java?
Yes.
I can't be sure about Java, but I normally, if you expose your service, it really shouldn't matter in which technology your service has been written. When I do, I'm not a Java specialist at all. We did do something like that once with a PHP created service. We could add a reference, but we did have to write some custom code there on the PHP side for the authentication and stuff like that. I'm thinking you will probably have to do something like that in Java as well, because of course it's no WCF on that side. But normally it should be possible, but the service should be of a certain standardized format, of course. Not every service is accessible. Yes?
One question, that if you use the REST-based endpoint,
Yes.
in your example you use this domain name and password, is it possible to use anything instead of that and have a custom?
So you're talking about my REST example with authentication where I passed in the username password from my Active Directory in this case. Well, the option you have there is basic authentication on Windows side, on your IIS side. So which credentials are valid actually depends on where your IIS gets its credentials from. That can be an Active Directory. It can also come from another database. Now there are always other options. Something you often see in a lot of applications that people like to pass in. I'm no fan of that, but it's done lots of times that people like to pass in username, password as parameters to their service calls or service methods. I don't like that, but it's done. Some people actually do that. That's another option you have, but I would say in this case with REST, if you're hosting it on IIS, you should go and look at where IIS gets its credentials from and program it on that side. In my case, it's an Active Directory, but it can actually be almost anything. But there are, of course, other ways as usual. Okay. Has anyone else got a question? No. Okay. Sorry about 5 minutes that I'm running 5 minutes late. It was a lot of content. But thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a nice day.